This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
We're now going to be talking to Professor Prof Fataar, who is on the line with us. He has written an anthology of essays, a group of essays, right, that spans anything from his Hajj to various Jumu'ah sermons, stretching some back even as far as COVID-19 and the crisis that we experienced there. Some of them are in Afrikaans, some of them are, talking about the complex times that we live in. Also, of course, the assault on Gaza by Israel, and then, of course, looking at, things such as morality and moral existence and so on and so forth. And so it's the coming together of all of those essays in a book that he has now published, which is titled as Cultivating an Ethics of Beauty and Excellence in Planetary Times, an Engaged Muslim Anthology. Professor Prof Fataar, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Shukran for that mouthful, mashallah.
No, thank you very much for look, I've seen some of these essays and I'm reading some of them again and again, reminded of moments in time in which you've reflected on that, of course, which not just confronted you, but sort of circumstances that we together found ourselves in. I want to start off with, the title of the book, Cultivating an Ethics of Beauty and Excellence in Planetary Times, an Engaged Muslims Anthology. What is your understanding of planetary times and how one then cultivates that ethics and beauty of excellence?
MashaAllah, yes. So an engaged Muslim is me. I try to conceive and think of myself as someone who engages with conceptions and problems in the world and provides a concerted activist response to that. That's what engaged means. Planetary times means it's a reference to the times that we're living in, particularly referencing ongoing iniquities and inequalities. One, our existences in the age of artificial intelligence, as well as the planetary transitions that we're going through in relation to its sustainability and so on. So those are shorthands for the kind of existence we now have to make. And the Islamic answer that we all have to search for is how do we activate our conduct? How do we activate our behavior? And the Islamic answer to that is that we activate it via virtues of beauty, excellence, judiciousness, forbearance. And this is what I think Islam has to offer. And all of that has to be inserted into the critical conversation about how we are in the world.
And the book, you say, is in dedication, tribute and gratitude to the late Imam Hassan Solomon, who you say his legacy reminds us that justice is not simply the absence of oppression, but the presence of love, empathy and equity. How does one determine that, or see that, identify it, when all that we're confronted with on a daily basis, is oppression, is war, is, crime, disease, struggles, economic challenges, etc. How does one find the tranquility of love, empathy and equity and discerning that?
Well, in the example of people like Hassan Solomon, before him, Imam Abdullah Harun and so on, is that they have responded in their time. In the 1960s, 50s, 60s, Imam Harun, Imam Hassan, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. And they identified what it means to live equitably and justly, given the realities that they confronted, and there was the anti-apartheid reality. So it was based on a negation of what was imposed upon them and an opposition to that, but always, for all of them and for us, therefore the challenge is always infused by the search for something alternative, something more beautiful, something more just, something more cooperative and activating of the human quality of coexistence and so on, right? That was for that time. And my big argument is to say we have to learn the ethical lessons from it, the moral lessons from it. We have to learn how they did it, and we have to draw the example, but we have to apply it in our circumstances. And planetary times is an indication that the circumstances 50 years later, have shifted fundamentally. And now we have to understand how the world works, the ugliness of the world, what structures hold up the ugliness of the world, and so on. And then to understand how we put to work and we invest in and we activate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's virtues, tawheed, and so on within current times. That is the ethical, but it's also the intellectual challenge. It is the challenge of how do we think through and position ourselves within the current moment. While we stand on history, we also have to activate our resources in the present time in order to establish just futures going forward. It is an enormous task. It is a task that I think we don't have a concerted commitment to, but there are sort of pockets of people who are doing that, and I want to be. My book is an attempt to insert myself into that debate and to invite people along.
In this debate, you rightfully say that sometimes it's got to do with narratives and the varying narratives that does exist, and you talk about the ethics of transcendence, described as a moral approach that emphasizes living in the presence of the divine, which inspires a commitment to values and responsibilities that extend beyond immediate self-interest. How did you come to determine that? Transcending, and are you transcending into, with, or where to? How does one understand what to me sounds like a journey, a continuing journey of trying to look at the broader more than what's in front of us?
Yes, so transcendence is always the struggle that we're engaged in, but we cannot escape the present. It is not as if we are going to transcend into another region where we are not going to live. We have to transcend our circumstances. We have to transcend the oppressiveness of our circumstances. We have to draw on our ethical values and resources in order to inform us about it. But transcendence also always circles back to the current, and it becomes part of the conversation of the current. So, in a sense, transcendence is not an out-of-body experience that will take you out of this world, but it brings you right back to the ethical and the aesthetical challenge of this world. Aesthetical challenge is a question of how we live, how do we construct this beautiful world that we want to, in a context in which the world is very, very ugly. It's neoliberalized in particular ways. It feels bad. It looks terrible. But aesthetically, it takes you into the complexity of that ugliness, and you're able to kind of understand how you construct senses of coexistence, senses of beautiful collaboration with people, and so on. So that ethics of transcendence is what motivates you, what informs you. It is the belief in Allah and what the belief in Allah really means to you as you live your life from day to day, and so on.
And sometimes some may say that seeking that transcendence is too, it's a little bit too broad. It's a little bit too with respect to use this word. I don't know what other word to get to now, but it could almost be superficial, right? And then you later, as you get into the nub of the book and reading some of the essays, etc., you talk about the challenges confronting communities, the political infractions that exist, and the intractable challenges of the daily. That there are those that are seeking to mitigate the impact of what are really complex set of challenges, which again could help or otherwise redirect in this effort to establish this sort of planetary existence into the future. How do we knuckle that down to, or how do you at least see the everyday poverties, the everyday crime situation, the everyday grind, etc., vis-a-vis trying to transcend into again a much more broader perspective about how we view life?
Right. So just as you say it, right, context is important. The material conditions of our lives are important. The structures by which we live our life, the resources that we may or may not have, and so on. The hurts, the harms, the sufferings that we encounter. And my answer in this book is that we have to stare that in the face directly. We have to understand how it impacts our bodies, how it impacts ourselves, how it impacts family relationships, our work lives, and so on and so forth. And we have to address them directly, right? And as we address them directly, we have to draw on our inner core, on our inner commitments, our commitments to divine, our commitments to Allah, to help us through this process, to condition our relations in that process. And the search for an ethics of beauty and excellence is firstly that we have to do that well. Always have to do that well. Don't do it slovenly. Don't do it sloppily, right? That's the excellence part. It's ihsan. And then the beauty part, that is where you transcend your own limitations. You're always in a conversation about how problematic your own response is. And so this transcendence is the idea that that you communicate with yourself, that you communicate with your community, that you communicate with the ugliness that's surrounding you, and enter into that conversation and to push it forward as you address the complex and concrete structural and personal challenges in the world. So it is this interaction between physical, everyday responses and in informing those responses with a greater sense of commitment to transcendent values, to the values that will allow you to discover a better version of yourself within that particular context. I can speak to you about one or two things that run through the book. The one is traumatic repetition, is that our communities are seemingly mired in repetition of trauma, as if trauma is the same thing that happened to you 10 years ago is now happening with you today. It's now exacerbated and so on. How do you interrupt that trauma? How do you re-narrate? How do you engage questions of traumatic existence so that you can confront it in the most effective way possible, and so on and so forth.
But do you believe that we learn lessons from these sorts of things? Because, as you say, the trauma that is quite pervasive as a narrative, as a theme within the book. Right from the get go, one of your earlier essays were on the example of Uyunene Mkhitwana, the young UCT girl that had been raped and killed while attending a post office in the Claremont area. Many years on from that, very terrible tragedy that we sit with, do you think all the outrage and the hurt and the lamenting and the emotions around this has left society in a better position, or have we assimilated to the point where we begin to think of those as normal, and increasingly then chipping away from this moral, ethical, community approach that you also highlight in the book as being the foundation of how to respond to issues. And so, in the retrospect from the time that we had that example of Uyunene Mkhitwana, how do you see society in a better or worse off shape?
Right. So the response to that very, very dastardly event in 2019 was important. The outrage was important. All communities got involved in that and so on. But if we didn't properly and do a couple of things to out of that response, then our response actually become part of the re-traumatization. Right. So in that essay and throughout the book, one wants to frame an appreciation of what is the core of the response, where the response come from. And my argument was in that, and it still is that we have to engage with gender violence and patterns of abuse in our community head on. We have to develop a discourse for it. We have to center the male figure in the center of that discourse. We have to problematize and trouble relationships in our communities and so on. We have to deal with and we educate ourselves and hold hands and find alternative ways of constructing gender relations and so on and so forth. Right. The issue is that how do we do that? Well, we have to use all our resources, our religious resources, our social resources, and develop a different kind of conversation. But we also have to get to the nub of the problem, and the nub of the problem is the distribution of our gender abusive patterns in our communities and so on. So if we haven't had that conversation, and my argument is that when we use a Quranic language, when we use a language of ethics and of beauty and excellence, we're able to confront ourselves, confront the ugliness, open up the ugliness, have a conversation about it, and then to reimagine out of those resources which they are there in our legacy, a better existence, a better world, and so on. I would want to say that many people may have had that conversation because the discourse against that particular event was so overwhelming, and it would have to move along those lines, and we have to create the structures and the conditions in our families, in our communities, for a better situation to emerge. Because if it doesn't, then the outrage would have just traumatized us then and continue traumatizing it as these kinds of events then get to repeat in our communities over and over again. And ethics of beauty and excellence wants to interrupt that, but substantially, conversationally, and set in process different kinds of ways of being in the world.
And you talk about, I suppose, the role of religion and prayer in the time of crisis. In fact, that's the title of one of the essays in the book, right? And you talk about, in our country, the majority experience poverty, hardship, and a lack of employment and food insecurity, and a general societal malaise associated with stressful circumstances. This is the context into which religion must speak, bring solace and comfort, address the needs, and offer counsel and prayer. Do you think our mosques do enough of that? I mean, it's great and well that we have, to a certain extent, the mosques play their certain roles in, the Friday sermons, encapsulating matters of faith and religion and so on. But for some at least, stop short of highlighting and playing a very active role in some of the issues that are affecting community, but by extension also Muslims as a whole. And sometimes there's, I suppose, in a prayer. And look, I mean, I'm just prophesizing ideas now for why I think that is the case. But it is also subjective, and again, context is important. One can talk about this in the realm of crime, then one can talk about this in the realm of gender-based violence and how women in our own households and homes, etc., sometimes are abused, men as well, or it can be something as awkward, for instance, as this increasing trend of same-sex marriages, for instance, or children that wish to color a little bit out of the lines, and how then to respond to that. I don't get the sense that we have a concrete enough structure or an approach, at least, with which to respond to that. And so let's then talk about the role then of religion in the time of crisis.
Yeah, you see, religious responses, what you and I observe and are a part of every day, becomes part of the symptomatic response to the complexities that we confronted. Like me and you, religious people often can't see the wood from the trees. That we can't do that because we are so deeply mired in it. And then our responses become truncated, it become limited, and so on and so forth. And so we have limited kinds of responses all over the place, right? And so what I try to do in this book is to kind of provide a more galvanizing sense of that limited response, and to kind of ratchet it up to a more systemic response, in which I try to posit the idea that religious resources, religious direction, the language that comes from the mimbar, from our educational institutions, can indeed develop a more systematic approach. That this is what I struggle with all the time. I struggle to develop a language that speaks into the crises that we're engaged in, and kind of provide certain sets of pictures of how that works, and certain responses to it. So these are all very difficult because we are mired into it. But I do think that religious people, religious leaders, community leaders, we all need to empower ourselves with a broader systemic response, because what our communities require from us is that we give an emotional outlet to the difficulties of our circumstances. On the one hand, we have to counsel to that, we have to do pastoral work in relation to that. That is what religious people are doing, but it requires something more concerted, something more systematic, and something much more palpably directly targeted at bringing relief, so on and so forth. Sometimes we get caught up in the discourse, and the discourse doesn't let us go. We've got to break through, and we've got to understand how we can work together more systematically.
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to be talking Afrikaans to you. I'm going to make a fool of myself. But you you have an essay there that deals with the issue of almost the religion studies, or at least having some sort of godsdienst in school. I'm wondering, taking a look at our schools today, and again, I don't want to be really negative and be a nanny about these issues, but many would say that bring God, or bring that sort of moral, ethical conscientization, if that even is the right word, within our schools. The challenge then with that is, whose God, does one then take, given the multitude of diverse communities and people that we all come from. But is there a necessity in some stage or the other to begin to be a little bit more sensitive to matters of faith within schools?
Ja, kyk, ons moet nou besluit as ons opvoedkundige bestel in skole wil gebruik om saam by te dra tot die stand van sake. I feel that schools have drawn in on themselves and have dropped the ball here in the broader critical citizenship terrain. And schools have become part of the identity quest about what kind of a tribe I belong to, what kind of religious identity. So that is schools are and schooling is. And I think we have to ask questions again about the role of schools in and the religious education in getting us to focus on our problems, in helping us understand what kind of critical citizenship and sustainable citizenship we have to do to kind of confront the bigger questions of the world. How do we cooperate across communities, across religious groups, and so on and so forth? We have to be invested in the literacy that gets us there, to get us information. And so there is an argument to make for confessional religiosity in school. I must learn to become a better Muslim, a better Christian in school. But that I want to argue that is half the story. The other half of the story, the very important half, is that how I develop a religious orientation in education that doesn't lock me into my own religion only, but allows me information and education about other religions so that I can live with people, so that I can address the struggles of community collaboratively. These struggles do not affect this group or that group. They confront all of us, since we have to have collective response. But we have to have a new set of educational discourses and processes and pedagogies that will allow us to know the other, to get to know the other, and to work with the other.
Talking about that, and at least staying with children, late in the book, of course, you, in one of the essays again, talk about, listening to the cries of our children, forming, some sort of, an adab, a model formation response to it. And you cite COVID-19 as an example in which a lot of that had been impaired on account of, social distancing, schools being locked down, and so on and so forth. We've been having a lot of conversation in the last week or two, in the country at least, about teenage pregnancies and behavioral patterns within schools at the moment, in which, really conducting education within a classroom, with a high amount of learners in a classroom is really difficult and proving to be difficult.
Yeah.
And in understanding then this transcendence that you so highlight as a necessity, I wonder whether we have the ability, the skills to be able to, as you put it, to listen intently with a heart that must extend to hearing the cries of our children. Do we have the necessary abilities to be able to do so? And how does one practically do that?
Yeah, so I think that COVID exacerbated the circumstances around which children are growing up. It has taken away the rug from under the community's feet to integratively deal with the challenges that raising children now requires. But it also created a situation that is now being exacerbated. The situation of an integrated commitment to our children has gotten worse, I think. If you look at all the statistics, all the statistics on health and welfare and educational and nourishment and so on and so forth, it's all gone further down. We haven't recovered. And so when we don't recover, but we don't ask questions about why we haven't recovered, then it's to use your word, life becomes normalized. Then therefore, structurally, individually, and systematically, we are unable to listen to the cries of our children. Because even their cries are muted, as I metaphorically argue in the book. So you can't hear it because everyone has adapted. And that is the big thing. The thing is that we have to be able to listen properly, to listen with our heart. Sam'a wa huwa shaheed, as a beautiful ayah that I love in the book, in the Quran that I quote in the book, that we have to challenge how we listen. And so this is the kind of this is the ethical challenge of the time. How do we listen? How do we adapt? And so on. In the book, I signal, while trying to be compassionate, that we are falling very, very far short on engaging with the children. One of the key issues about children is that they are speaking in different registers. Their social media registers, their language literacies are now generationally at a distance from the adult community and so on. So educators, parents, our communities and so on, leaders and so on, need to understand that we have to connect and we have to provide the structures and we have to provide the support systemically as well. This might sound that I am sort of giving the state a pass, I'm not giving the state a pass. I'm not giving governance a pass. They've all got to be brought to the table. All got to be learn how to listen to the cries of the children, so that we can address their concerns much more palpably and much more directly and much more properly.
We're talking to Professor Fataar on the book that he has now put together with OCAF. It's called Cultivating an Ethics of Beauty and Excellence in Planetary Times, an Engage Muslims Anthology. And we are reviewing it this morning here on Radio 786. And happy to take your questions or thoughts on 0786 10 11 12. I have two more essays that I want to focus on. The one being your journey, of course, on Hajj and your personal accounts of what that so does mean. Looking back, to 2022, if I remember correctly, which is when you went to go and perform Hajj. Reading back that essay, do you still pretty much feel the same way, or have thoughts crystallized a little bit more? Do you see things differently after, that spiritual hug that you may have received on Hajj, of course, now is much less felt than what it did in 2022? How do you see this journey, what's now 2 years on?
Yes, so I am so glad that my wife and I wrote those two essays. I wrote one, and my wife and I wrote the other one, because that was written a month or two after the Hajj, right? And it captures the emotional and the spiritual intensity and impact, right? 2 years later, I have come to understand how that impact has kind of morphed, how it has kind of dissipated, and how, because we've written it down, we can remind ourselves, and in speaking to other Hujjaj, we can remind ourselves of the intensity of that particular commitment. But the issue is that as we've moved further from the actual experience, so we've had to adapt about what the Hajj then would have meant to us. And I think that is the purpose of the Hajj, in the sense that you have to continuously figure out. The challenge is for you to kind of continuously figure out. It doesn't occur to you, the lessons of the Hajj, in the same way that it did 2.5 years ago. But they are still very important. The Hajj is a moment of physical and spiritual transcendence. You go through that process, you do all the rituals, and it allows you, presents you the opportunity to transcend yourself while you are develop an embodiment of self that does good. That particular challenge still remains, but now you are in the secular world, back in the secular world. The secular world speaks to you, and what the Hajj also would have done to you is that it provides you the acute senses to begin to continuously confront and work out how the world reveals itself to you all the time, because that kind of illumination of the revelation of the world into your own consciousness is something that happens all the time and every day. Some kind of implicit thing that I say in this book is that you have to be alert to the moment, to the time. I have 2 or 3 essays on time in the book. You have to live, as I say, in the waqt. Yeah, and the waqt is here and now. What is the ethical or the just quality of the moment right here in 2025? And how does the body respond to this waqt based on the values that you need to draw on, based on the transcendent values that you need to activate within the particular moment in the context that we're in? That was the lesson of the Hajj, and that stays with you. The methodology stays with you as you move further and further away from your actual Hajj.
Gaza and the oppression, of course, in Palestine is a feature point in the book as well. And you talk about the ethics of ihsan as a cornerstone of Palestinian solidarity. Maybe just for those that are not too familiar, the definition of ihsan vis-a-vis the Palestinian question and how then to express that solidarity. And maybe to tie in what your thoughts are, 15 months since October the 7th, where we are right now, and the 15 months that we've lived through and the lessons we can glean from there.
Right. So for me, the 15 months post October 7th, post 100 years of colonialism, post 75 years of Nakba, and is that the 15 months have just intensified a pattern, right? And the pattern is occupation and genocide and dehumanization. That pattern hasn't been removed. It hasn't dissipated. It has just morphed. It will continue to morph, and the Palestinian struggle will remain with us, because as the power distributions in the world operates, Zionism, Israel being propped up by the Americans and so on, in a unipolar world, it's not going to go away. It's going to morph. The ethics of beauty and ihsan understands that, and it figures out how to make the commitment to Gaza and to similar scenarios all over the world, not just Gaza, and for you to understand how your decolonial and your liberationist commitments are fundamentally framed by being in this world in which all of these imperial infractions take place. But what Gaza does remind you, and what the people of Palestine reminds you, is that life goes on, is that responses must be made, is that life amidst death, or the death, or what is called fancily called necropolitical life amidst death, is the context in which we live. It's both metaphorical, but it's also physical. We have to understand how to live this deathly life, how to give life to it, how not to be beaten by it. And so the poem by Rifat Al-Arir, where he says, if I must die, you must live to tell my tale, just encaptures it, that in our taqdeer is the question of life and death, and yet we must live to the fullness. And ihsan is about how do we live in the most beautiful and most exceptionally excellent way into the fullness of that life, so that those who have constructed and constrained our living do not determine how we respond. Ihsan means that we respond on our own human basis in relation to the lives that we live. We continue, we breathe, we make lives, we establish our families, our community lives, and so on, all in the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and yet also in the service of our everyday existences. So we draw directly from the inspiration of people who are most oppressed, because they have indicated to us that they are making the commitments to continue establishing life. It is for me the most profoundly paradoxical thing that you can imagine, where you are visited upon these brutalizing conditions, and yet in the way in which you establish your life, you live the most beautiful existence, because you are committed to something bigger, and you are committed to the ground on which you stand, that you want to liberate.
And perhaps lastly, as a parting word, the book also contains some essays, that were sent in and around the month of Ramadan, and with another Ramadan that's approaching. How can we engage in the contents of this particular essay in perhaps orientating our thinking going into this month?
Ramadan for me is a month of stories. It's a month of narrative. It's a month of aligning the quality of the stories that we tell ourselves, and we imagine new stories, because we are in a situation in which we are acutely physically restrained. And what comes out of it, it activates our imagination to tell old stories better, stories of our genealogy, to find our genealogy. That's an interesting thing that I have been doing in the last 2 years, to find genealogy of family and community and so on, and to narrate that genealogical story, so that we can address the trauma that's associated with, but the joviality and the conviviality of our stories. Our communities do not just have traumatic stories to tell. We also live jovial and convivial lives, and we live interactive lives. We love to laugh. We love to be happy. We love to be on the sports field, and so on and so forth. Ramadan is an opportunity to excavate those stories with each other around the table, right? Around the suhoor table, around the iftar table, after tarawih, and so on, and to engage with each other and encounter throughout the stories that we tell, new versions of that story that empowers us. For me, Ramadan is a month of stories.
Professor Aslam Fataar, thank you. As always, brilliant work being put together by yourself. And the book, of course, launched now. Where can members of the community get access to the book? Where will it be available?
The book is available at Protea bookshops, at exclusives, at the book lounge, and so on. It will be available at Academia Library and one or two other venues on the Cape Flats within the week. And also the launch will be on Saturday, Saturday the 8th at 11 o'clock in Cape Town at the Homecoming Center. People can be in touch perhaps with 786 or with myself if they want to come to the launch. Please indicate that to us. We can have 2 hours of great conversation with the audience and with some people at the book, which I'm looking forward to. So you are all invited if you RSVP. So thank you very much, Tashriq. I hope to see you there too, inshallah.
Indeed, I'll be there. Thank you very much for having joined us this morning, Professor Prof Fataar, having written the book Cultivating an Ethics of Beauty and Excellence in Planetary Times and Engaged Muslims Anthology. Do you see yourself as an engaged Muslim? And I'm curious to know in what way or shape you see that. Is it through activism, through community involvement, through being yourself, through going about your day? In what way and how do you see yourself as an engaged Muslim?
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.